as a country, we have to carefully consider the risks that companies like Huawei pose if we're going to allow them into our telecommunications infrastructure.
Well, that is the director of the FBI warning about the dangers of using Chinese mobile phone technology. But should you listen, or are they just scaremongering? Well, we're going to be talking about Huawei. They sell more handsets than Apple these days, but they have a serious PR problem, at least in the West. Now, Washington accuses them of effectively being a branch of the Chinese government and a huge risk to national security. Critics say the Americans are just jealous because Huawei's winning the race to develop 5G. Should we be worried? Let's take a close look at the evidence.
Huawei has become the largest telecom equipment manufacturer in the world.
Huawei components are being used to create the new architecture of global super high-speed 5G internet technology.
毫无疑问，5G 的大规模部署时机已经到来了。
We're on the cusp of this huge rollout of 5G technology around the world.
Yet the rush to build the super-fast wireless network comes with a risk.
There are fears that Beijing may use companies like Huawei to get access to the new generation networks.
It might have built-in back doors so that the Chinese could intercept messages, communications, violate the security of the networks.
This is a global drama we're watching roll out, and it is going to be a big story.
News of the arrest in Canada of the chief financial officer of China's huge Huawei telephone company. Her name is Meng Wanzhou, and she's expected to be extradited to the United States.
2 grand jury indictments charge Huawei with theft of corporate secrets, evasion of U.S. sanctions on Iran, obstruction of justice, and other offenses.
Both sets of charges expose Huawei's brazen and persistent actions to exploit American companies and financial institutions and to threaten the free and fair global marketplace.
The speculation here has been that this is a message from the United States that China, as well as Chinese companies, need to change what Washington has long seen as unfair trade practices.
This is definitely the culmination of a much larger war against Huawei. We're trying to weaken China and its companies because if we don't have control over that infrastructure, someone else does.
This is going to play into this Chinese theme that China is rising, that it is in fact taking its rightful place on the world stage, but at the same time that the Western world, and especially the United States, is trying to do everything it can to keep China down.
一段时间以来，美方动用国家力量抹黑和打压特定的中国企业，企图扼杀企业的正当合法经营。
Well, let's bring in our panel now, and in Beijing, we have IN A TEACUP, an American entrepreneur who says the US is trying to stifle its competitors. Lynette Ong, she joins us from the University of Toronto, where she's a professor of political science. And finally, Elliot Zargman, a tech podcast host who focuses on China. Elliot, we'll start with you. You spent some 9 years in China. You met Huawei executives. You even worked with them from time to time. Can we trust the company or not?
That's a very complicated question. Yes and no. It all depends on who you are. What we do know about the company is that they have something called wolf culture. And wolf culture basically can be defined along 3 terms. One is insularity. So if you look at the people that they bring them in at a very young age, usually from 3rd or 4th tier city backgrounds, usually who are not very wealthy, and they're looking for what in Chinese they would call their Di Tongjin, their first pot of gold. And they bring them in there, they kind of what they would call xinao, like brainwashing them. I think that's kind of too strong of a term, but they bring them into the culture, and the people who are loyal to the company, they rise within the company. So if you look at their senior executives, of their top executive team, they're 17 people, and they're all Chinese. They've all been with the company for at least 20 years. Another term to know when looking at this company is horse race. So in Chinese, they call it a saima, right? Which is that what they will do is they will basically take teams and they will pit them against each other internally. And what this does is it creates this intensity that they will kind of fight against each other in order to get something done quicker and often below cost, which has led to their success. And the third is this idea of fendou, which is struggle. And it's this idea that nobody should be too comfortable at the company. So a lot of these things that we would consider standard HR practices in the West, they're not going to do that. They're going to overwork them. They're going to work them very, very hard, and they're not going to let anyone get too comfortable.
Now, you were mentioning where they may lack in certain aspects of their company. They make more than make up for it in manpower, right?
Absolutely. So I mean, this goes back a long time in China, where China hasn't always been, as technologically advanced as other countries or had all the same advantages as other countries, but they have had the people. So they've thrown their people at problems. And this is what Huawei's done as well. So they've said, okay, well, if we have a project that we need to get done, let's send a ton of our workers from our headquarters in Shenzhen, China, to whatever country they need to go to, and let's send them on assignment, and let's get the project done. So they throw resources at the problem, usually manpower, and they get it done faster and often cheaper than their competitors.
But why should we be any more concerned about Huawei's company culture than we are about, say, Apple or Samsung?
Well, it depends on who we are, right? So,
well, put it from the main complainant, if you like, in this case, the United States, the West, Japan, maybe even South Korea.
Well, the fundamental premise is, or the fundamental idea here is that China is not an ally of those countries when it comes to diplomacy or defense.
And that brings us to our next point. That is the culture. Let's look at the alleged links to the Chinese government. And we'll start with the founder, Ren Zhengfei, an extraordinary character. As a young man, he was an engineer in the People's Liberation Army, took some of those skills, set up Huawei with just around, $5,000 in 1987. Now, just over 30 years later, an annual turnover close to $90 billion. You'd think he'd want to show off, but in fact, up until this crisis, he'd only given a handful of interviews. But now, he's been forced to defend his company dozens of times.
This is a competition, and you do well or you don't. If you do well, you will certainly have customers. You don't have to worry.
Well, Ren and his top executives always say it's a private company owned by employees with no links to the Chinese government, at least not the exaggerated links that some are saying. But the US Senator Tom Cotton begs to differ.
Huawei and ZTE are nothing more than extensions of the Chinese Communist Party. Huawei's CEO was an engineer for the People's Liberation Army. The company's livelihood consists largely of a steady stream of government contracts. The only reason Huawei is the second largest smartphone maker in the world and ZTE the fourth, though, is because we've let them run wild for too long.
Well, let's pick up on that accusation and go to Einar. Einar, what he's trying to say is, were it not for preferential treatment by the Chinese government, Huawei would not be the success it is today.
That's completely untrue. Huawei is a political, economic hostage in a game between the United States and China. I mean, if you start looking at the culture that was quoted before, as you said, Apple, IBM, GE Medical, all of these companies were famed for doing exactly the same thing. 3M used to pit its teams against each other in the boardroom to try to figure out who was going to be in charge of what project and what project would be done.
I know, thank you. Well, let's move on to Ren's daughter now, Meng Wanzhou. She's Huawei's chief financial officer, and she was arrested on December the 1st in Canada and is awaiting extradition to the United States. Let's go to Lynette now. Lynette, you're in Canada. You're following the story for us. What do you make of the arrest? Was it political, or was it a matter of law enforcement, as they say?
I think it's really quite complicated. From Canada's perspective, because Canada has an extradition treaty with the United States. So when the United States made a request for us to arrest Meng Wanzhou, Canada simply has to oblige. But after the arrest, President Trump also said that Meng's arrest could potentially be used as a bargaining chip in the trade war between the States and Canada, which, prima facie makes it politically motivated, which casts doubt on the legal basis of the case.
But the legal case against her is that, the allegation anyway, is that she misrepresented her business's dealings with Iran and said that they were compliant with US sanctions.
But there are also arguments against it, saying that, Huawei is not the first company that has gone against trade sanctions against Iran, and no one has been arrested before. In previous cases, companies have been slapped fines. So why make the arrest now? This is intrinsically political. I think there are arguments to be made on both sides.
Well, of course, China's government has warned Canada of, quote, grave consequences and called the arrest unreasonable, unconscionable and vile in nature. Come back to you for a moment, Lynette. Isn't Canada afraid of these grave consequences? We've already had 2 arrests of Canadians in China. We can't say they are linked, but surely Canada is afraid of what its second biggest trading partner might do to it.
So let's put it this way. I think by making those statements, China has actually lost a lot of soft power. And true, China is a very powerful country. It's a very large country in terms of trade, economic power, and military power. But in this very, very globalized world, I think we can all appreciate how important soft power is, because hard power can only get you that far.
Let's go back to Elliot for a second. Elliot, what's your take on the arrest of Meng?
So we know that there are legal components involved, right? We know that there is evidence there. However, what Trump did say is that he would be willing to use Meng as a trade chip if it helps the country and if it helps trade negotiations. Now, you could look at this and say this is just Trump putting his foot in his mouth the way that Trump does, or you could look at it as a gross violation of rule of law. So, it really is a Rorschach test here. You can look at it however you want to see it.
Elliot, that's politics for you. Well, the arrest of Huawei's CFO is just one of Washington's battles with Huawei. Federal prosecutors have also indicted the company for allegedly stealing from an American telecoms company.
Huawei began a concerted effort to steal information about a robot that T-Mobile used to test mobile phones. In an effort to build their own robot, Huawei's engineers allegedly violated confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements with T-Mobile by secretly taking photos of the robot, measuring it, and even stealing a piece of it.
Well, our man in Beijing thinks it's all a bit of a storm in a teacup. Ina, the case was originally a civil one, and Huawei had to pay a small fine of around, $4.5 million to settle that. Were they banged to rights?
Well, if this is the most that the U.S. has, it definitely is a storm in a teacup. This is not the kind of thing where you're going to say, this is evidence, red hot evidence that they have been engaged in nefarious activities. Tappy the robot was just that. He tapped the telephone screen, and the Huawei people acted like Keystone Cops.
Ina, thank you. Let's go back to Elliot. Elliot, you are aware of some of these emails that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, has dredged up, and what do they say?
Yeah, so in the Tappy case, in the indictment for it, the Department of Justice had internal Huawei emails that discussed a system internally where they would incentivize employees within Huawei China that would report and bring stolen IP, in essence, to the company. What the bigger issue is when it comes to Huawei and a lot of these Chinese companies, it's not about these specific instances. It's about systematic IP theft that I think undermines the global trade system.
Well, 5G's been mentioned a lot over the course of this show, but what exactly is it? And why are a number of countries preventing Huawei from being involved? Well, for the United States, it kind of resembles the old space race with the USSR.
It's 1960-something and the space race is on. It's Russia versus the USA. The benefits of winning are inestimable. As the old saying goes, to the victor, the spoils.
It's true, winning the space race yielded massive tech benefits for years to come, from laptops to satellite TVs and smoke detectors. And whilst not as glamorous, the 5G race is just as crucial. The revolutionary mobile technology of the future is going to be faster, a lot faster, up to 20 gigabits per second. That means you can download an episode of everyone's favorite show, 26 Minutes of Perfection, in just 0.8 seconds. Currently with 4G, it would take you 1.5 minutes. And if you're still on 3G, you'd have to wait 6.5 hours. But it's not just about speed, it's also about response rates. And that is crucial for some of the futuristic ideas out there. Take driverless cars. Using 5G technology, they're going to react 200 times faster than you or me. Yep, faster than a Formula One racing driver by far. And that could prevent those dreadful pile-ups. It'll also help doctors conducting remote surgeries and improve and enhance real-time online gaming. So it seems the benefits are unlimited. But, yes, there's always a but, there's also a dark side. Right now, we live in a 4G world where America's Qualcomm is in the lead. But what if things change? China's Huawei dominates. Giant companies in the 5G race could soon know everything about us. What we do, where we go, who we meet. US officials are afraid that Huawei will spy for the Chinese government, help to steal intellectual property from companies, and even pass on state secrets. But surely we'll be protected by the regulators. Well, that won't be possible if the big companies come to dominate the regulatory body itself. At this stage, the race is still on. No one can predict for sure who's going to win the competition. But we do know one thing. Whoever controls 5G will take a controlling stake in our future. So to recap, Huawei is banned from participating in the 5G networks in the following countries: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the US, and in the UK there's no official ban yet, but British Telecom is keeping Huawei out of its 5G network. Let's go back to Elliot for a second. Elliot, why so much fear and mistrust?
Well, there are a number of different reasons. One that is cited by many countries is this national intelligence law in China, which says that all individuals and companies must comply with requests from law enforcement and intelligence authorities, which means that if the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party asks Huawei for information, they have to give it to them.
What is the worst case scenario, the doomsday scenario, Elliot?
Well, it all depends on how much everything is going to be connected in the future with 5G, which is, foreseeably everything. So you could shut down the entire communications grid of a country. Just as with nuclear weapons, a nuclear bomb is not necessarily realistic, but it does give, for example, North Korea or Iran or whatever country that has them, more power, more influence.
That's a very good point. Let's pick that up with Ina now. But it does give them leverage in conversations about trade, perhaps about getting their citizens back if they're arrested abroad.
Well, quite frankly, you could say the same thing about Qualcomm. They have the same power with 4G. I cited the example before where hard drive is sold by American companies all over the world.
Well, there's been no blanket ban in Europe yet, but leaders, including Chancellor Angela Merkel, do have a few questions.
German consumers need to be certain that the Chinese state isn't getting access to data on Chinese products that are sold in Germany.
Well, perhaps she sees how the Chinese government uses data on its own citizens and thinks, that's not for us. The Chinese are being watched closely, with some 170 million CCTV cameras across the country. Roughly 1 camera for every 8 people. And soon, the ratio will be more like 1 camera for every 2 people, cementing it as one of the most surveilled countries in the world. To put that in perspective, it's way ahead of even Britain, where there's 1 camera for every 11 people. And the Chinese government is taking things even further, developing Sharp Eyes, a national scheme connecting government and private sector surveillance systems. It will integrate facial recognition, video analytics, and artificial intelligence to identify anyone who might be a threat to the social order, from thieves to jaywalkers. The name of the project echoes a Mao-era communist slogan, "The people have sharp eyes." All this new data could be used to feed the country's controversial social credit system, a point system where citizens will be ranked on their trustworthiness. Good behaviour, for example donating to charity, could lead to perks like faster internet services and visas for Europe. Bad behaviour, reckless driving or smoking where you shouldn't be, could get you banned from flying. Cameras on every corner, the latest artificial intelligence technology, and huge stores of personal data. In China, Big Brother is working overtime. Back to Elliot, lived in China around 9 years or so. Did you feel watched there?
Well, it depends on what we mean by watched. I think that there are security cameras everywhere, and you have to be concerned about being watched. But it was not something that impacted my life, I think, to a large degree. However, it never impacts your life until it does. And then once someone decides, somebody who's in power decides that you're somebody who should be watched, then you're in trouble. And I think that the bigger issue here is about transparency and rule of law. So it's that China doesn't have a system where people can be ensured, okay, well, these are my rights. This is, what can protect my data, can protect my information. So it makes this system seem scarier than it could potentially be, because there are a lot of potential positive upsides to this kind of system.
Sure, but what about the interception of text messages? Tell us about that.
Yeah, this happens quite a bit. So if there's a sensitive term that you're sending a message to somebody on WeChat, or a sensitive image that is kind of causing what they would consider to be disruption, they'll block it. So I'll send a message to a friend or an image to a friend that I think is perfectly fine, but apparently they've decided it's not okay, and my friend will not get it. That happens quite often.
Let's go back to Lynette. Lynette, there is a concern, as Angela Merkel just explained, that consumers are worried that through the Chinese devices, the Chinese government has access to their data.
Well, I think for consumers not living in China, living in a foreign country, I think the onus is actually up to the national government of their country to protect the data privacy of the citizens, which is why in this country we are going through a major debate right now whether we should adopt 5G technology. So I think I think this is the responsibility of the national government as well.
Elliot, if Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks tells us anything, it's that the United States already uses American companies and other allies' companies to monitor us and to collect our data without us even knowing. What's the difference?
I think that you make a very good point there. I think that in some ways there's not that much difference, that people should be concerned about what the U.S. government might do to them. I think that the two issues that I always go back on are, one is legal rights and two is transparency. So the fact that we can know what the laws are in a place like the U.S., the fact that at least if I'm an American citizen, I have rights, I think that's a very important differentiation. So that's why I think if you talk about the differences between the U.S. and the Chinese systems, or the West and Chinese systems, I think at these systems, when you look at the global scale, these really do matter. And there's something that I think when you look at China, you say, okay, they're not allies, or they're not military or diplomatic allies. They don't have the same kind of systems. This does make a difference, and these issues like transparency and rule of law matter.
Elliot, thank you. Well, as we've heard, the 5G race between the Americans and the Chinese has been compared to the space race between the Americans and the Russians. And judging by Huawei's ads, they get it.
Thank God you finally landed on the moon. I miss Earth already. Can we get a congratulations picture down here? No problem. Uh-oh.
Well, a little bit cheeky, but quite amusing. That's all we have time for this week. Thank you to all our guests, Elliot, Lynette, and Ina. Thank you as well. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. Till next week, goodbye.